For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by constitutional trial attorney Daniel Sheehan. Daniel is one of the most influential public interest lawyers in the country. He's worked on a number of cases, including the Pentagon Papers case and the Karen Silkwood case, that have changed the course of American history. In 1980, he founded the Christic Institute, where he served as general counsel and chief trial attorney. Daniel has also served as chief trial attorney for the Romero Institute and the chief trial counsel for the ACLU's Rocky Mountain States chapter. His new book, The People's Advocate, The Life and Legal History of America's Most Fearless Public Interest Lawyer, is a must-read for anyone who wants to know the inside story of some of the most important trials of the past half-century. Daniel Sheehan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks so much for being with us. I'm curious, what got you interested in the law in the first place? Let's start with you, Daniel. What drew you into this, and then what got you into this kind of law?
Well, actually, Tom, originally back in 1963, when I graduated from high school, I was going to go to the Air Force Academy. And it turns out that I was #1 in the competition for New York State for the senatorial appointment. But Jacob Javits, the United States Senator, actually gave the appointment to the son of one of his major financial contributors. And so I went back to the Congressional District to get the Congressional District appointment. And that congressman gave the appointment to the son of the Republican mayor of Glens Falls. And so I was completely freaked out that the rules didn't seem to be working. It struck me that the system was out of tune. So I decided I would become a lawyer and spend some time helping to tune the system to get it back into tune. But the more time I spent being a lawyer, the more I realized that the system wasn't really out of tune. It's just that it was playing a completely different song from that which we had been told when we were in high school and studying civics. So I decided I was going to be a lawyer, and I became a civil rights lawyer. Helped found the Civil Rights Law Review at Harvard, Harvard Law School, and went on to practice in this particular area at that time from 1968, that sort of halcyon year, when I was the editor of the Harvard Civil Rights Law Review, all the way on through. And while I was there, I actually initiated the case that went to the United States Supreme Court to establish the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. And because of that, I was hired by the #1 law firm on Wall Street that represents NBC. And there I was there when we received the Pentagon Papers. So I became intimately involved in the initial decisions to decide whether to publish the papers, and if so, what was going to happen with the Nixon administration. And so I went into doing that and was in all of the closed-door hearings with the judges and all the way to the United States Supreme Court. I was one of the few the lawyers that was deeply involved in that all the way to the end. And from there, I went to F. Lee Bailey's office, and I was there when he was retained to represent James McCord in the Watergate burglary. So I ended up finding out about what was exactly going on, what caused the Watergate burglary, what was behind the Watergate burglary. And because of that, I left and went back to Harvard to go to divinity school. After having finished Harvard College in '67, Harvard Law School in '70, in 1973, I went back to Harvard Divinity School and studied the origins of natural law and the relationship of natural law to the Constitution of the United States. And so that's how I ended up in this particular specialized area of the law.
That's remarkable. I mean, you've been at the pivot point of so many major American historical. It's the thing that makes your book so amazing, The People's Advocate. It's almost Forrest Gump-like, except that you were intentional about all this stuff. You know, you were being driven.
Yeah, that's
right. You know, you said you were involved in all the way to the Supreme Court in the first essentially shield laws. What are your thoughts on the current state of that? I mean, right now we have Dianne Feinstein saying that we have to define what a journalist is. It seems to me, and please correct me if, because you're the guy who knows this stuff and I don't, but it seems to me that instead of protecting journalists, we need to be protecting acts of journalism, because we live in an era where pretty much anybody can commit an act of journalism which should be protectable. In other words, revealing something, blowing the whistle. People can be publishers tomorrow, you know, put up a blog. But to say that, oh, we're only protecting journalists, and somebody is only a journalist if they draw a paycheck from a company that we approve of, is the first step down the road to state certification and state control, ultimately, of a press. Your thoughts?
Well, this is all part and parcel, as you know, Tom, of the descending upon the United States of this national security state mentality that's happened since 9/11. And in that period of time since 9/11, we have kind of an increasing drumbeat of kind of reactionary, fear-driven policies in the United States now. And this is one of them, to try to cut back against the major shield laws that we got passed back in 1971, 72, and 73. We got all of these shield laws established on the grounds that it was a belief of the state legislatures that there was a clear constitutional right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources in order to continue to have the flow of information coming, especially with regard to government corruption and national security matters. Almost all of those issues arose around national security matters, so that the relationship between the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources and the right of the New York Times to publish the classified 47 volumes of the Pentagon Papers was an intimate relationship that was there. And I was there for both of those cases and helped establish what the principles and rules were. But what happened is that there was a reaction that set in against this, that as we know, the high watermark of this entire confrontation between our generation, the idealist generation of the 21st century, and the World War II generation, that major confrontation came to a head over the Vietnam War and in the Pentagon Papers case. And what happened is the reactionaries in that generation struck back, and they brought into power Ronald Reagan. They brought him into power, and as you all know, of course, the chairman of his campaign was Bill Casey, and that they actually came to power by actually striking a deal with the Hezbollah to continue to keep our 52 American hostages that had been taken at the embassy in Iran, to keep them in custody until after the election, at which point Ronald Reagan agreed not only to give them TOW missiles, but to also provide other kind of assistance to the Hezbollah and the right-wing Muslim Brotherhood. And we've seen the repercussions of that now, 15, 18 years later. We're now confronted by these people who were armed in a large part by the Reagan and Bush administrations. So that the practice of constitutional law has placed me right at the center of a lot of the major issues that arose, not only around the Vietnam War and the right of journalists to protect their confidential news privileges, but also the fact of all the issues that are going on now with the national security state, the attempt to chase down Edward Snowden, his need to retreat into one of the very two countries in the whole world, China and then Russia, retreating into these places where the few places where the United States military doesn't deem themselves authorized to just go in and unilaterally assert its power, its full spectrum dominance, which was the theme of those reactionaries inside the Reagan-Bush administrations and in the W. Bush administration. This policy is basically attempting to replicate the 19th century imperialist worldview that was dominant in the Western civilization prior to the rise of the Soviet Union in 1917. And as soon as the Soviet Union dissolved itself voluntarily on December 31st of 1991, Paul Wolfowitz and the others that were in the Bush senior administration at that time came together and designed this entire foreign policy concept of full spectrum dominance. And that's what we're looking at right now. We're living in the domestic side of a national security state that is engaged in a global policy of the establishment of full spectrum dominance on the part of the United States military. That's what's happening right now. And as a constitutional lawyer, my obligation is to protect our American people and to protect the world from unconstitutional conduct on the part of our executive branch and also on the part of our United States Congress. And we've been attempting to do this through the judicial branch, an allegedly independent judicial branch. But since the election of Ronald Reagan, 73% of all of the federal judges that have been appointed by Ronald Reagan or George Bush Jr. you know, and that we have these reactionaries from the Federalist Society now in the judicial branch, which are making it virtually impossible to seek protection from the judicial branch against the unconstitutional conduct of the executive. So a constitutional litigation attorney such as myself finds myself right at the center of these types of confrontations between the raw assertion of executive power, whether it's rendition or torturing people or asserting the right under the National Defense Authorization Act to unilaterally arrest American citizens and hold them in detention with no right of habeas corpus, no right to counsel. And no one would believe that this could possibly have happened in our country, but here it is. What I do in the book, in The People's Advocate, is I explain from a front row seat that I had throughout these entire last 3 decades what it looked like seeing this national security state come and descend upon our country. That's why the book is so important, not because it's all about me, because it's not. It's about an era of when this happened, how it is that the executive branch, step by step by step, moved into a position of asserting its power not only over the United States citizenry to threaten to arrest us without right to counsel or right to a trial by a civilian jury. We can now be tried in front of a military tribunal and be convicted and sentenced to life in prison without a single civilian review by any court at all. Now, this is quite outrageous. In the book, The People's Advocate explains step by step how this came to pass so that people can see how this came to pass so that we can mobilize to do something about it. That's why I think it's important for people to read the book and understand how we came to this pass so that we can know what to do about it.
Yeah, and one of the more important pivot points, we're talking with Daniel Sheehan. The book that he's referring to is The People's Advocate, The Life and Legal History of America's Most Fearless Public Interest Lawyer. One of those pivot points was the Iran-Contra affair, and President Bani Sadr of Iran was elected in 1980 during that campaign, Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter, on a platform in Iran of freeing the hostages. He won overwhelmingly, and he published an op-ed piece in March of this year, of 2013, in response to the movie Argo, published an op-ed piece saying the vast majority of Iranians did not want to hold the hostages. After he was elected, he went to the mullahs and said, okay, and this was while the campaign was still going on here in the United States, said, let's free the hostages. And they said to him, no, you can't. We cut a deal with the Reagan campaign. That was published in the Christian Science Monitor in March of this year, and there wasn't a peep about it. You know, the president of Iran saying that President Reagan committed treason. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. We have to take a quick break, and we come right back with that. Daniel Sheehan, more of tonight's Conversations with the Great Minds with Daniel Sheehan right after the break.
5 seconds. And over the mic is all feeling to go.
Did you know the press is the only industry specifically mentioned in the Constitution?
Stand by.
That's because a free and open press is critical to our democracy.
Track alpha. Roll alpha.
In fact, the single biggest threat facing our nation today is the corporate takeover of our government and our press.
Stand by, camera 1.
We've been hijacked by a handful of powerful transnational corporations that will profit by destroying what our founding fathers once built up. I'm Tom Hartman, and on this show, we reveal the big picture of what's actually going on in the world. We go beyond identifying the problem.
We try to fix it.
Rational debate and a real discussion of the critical issues facing America.
Stand by on camera. Go.
Ready to join the movement? Then welcome to the big picture. And welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with Daniel Sheehan, constitutional trial attorney, founder of the Christic Institute, and author of the new book, The People's Advocate, The Life and Legal History of America's Most Fearless Public Interest Lawyer. To get back to where we left off, we were talking about how, actually, let me put this in a slightly larger frame, because in your book you talk about these things. First of all, Jack Kennedy was killed, and whoever did that apparently got away with it. Then we have this other turning point where Richard Nixon committed a number of crimes. He got away with many, but he didn't get away with all of them. He was forced out of office. So there was a lot of stuff that came out of that church committee, and you know, the laws about transparency. It was a major turning point. And then Reagan, Bush, Reagan committed this crime to come into office, committed what I would argue is treason to get office, and was never prosecuted, although you were involved in trying to prosecute him. These are each kind of like cyclical flips, historical cyclical flips. What are your thoughts on that? And you can start out by responding to my comments about what President Bonnie Sauter said. I'm curious your thoughts on why the American media did not touch his public proclamation that Reagan had cut a deal in the background with the Iranians to hold the hostages.
Well, this has been addressed very directly, Tom, that Gary Sick, who was the National Security Council advisor to President Jimmy Carter, working with him on the negotiations, has written a book called The October Surprise. And in that, he has a whole conclusion where he says that those of us who've lived in Washington, D.C. for 20 years or more have become accustomed to the petty scandals in Washington. An individual senator will be found to have been a womanizer, a chronic womanizer, or a congressman will be caught dipping his hand into the till of his campaign funds for his private uses, et cetera. And when that kind of a scandal is exposed, all the media rush in, and all of their colleagues excoriate those people for having done wrongdoing of that nature, and everyone celebrates how the system really works and how the media really come to the rescue of the American people in cases like that. But Gary Sick pointed out in his conclusion, he said, however, that those of us who have spent 20 years or more in Washington know that there's another entirely different category of crime that has been committed in Washington upon occasions. And in that case, it is a kind of a crime that is so threatening that if it's revealed by the American media or by the American political structures, it will undermine the blind confidence on the part of the governed in their governors.
Now, if I could interrupt you just very quickly and speak to that. We've played on this program just 2 years ago, I believe it was, the Johnson Library, the LBJ Library, finally released the tapes of his conversations when he was in the White House. And we played this tape of Lyndon Johnson talking to Everett Dirksen during the campaign when Vice President Humphrey was running against Nixon in '68, saying, we know that Nixon is cutting a deal with the South Vietnamese not to go to the bargaining table in Paris, because he had already cut a deal with the South Vietnamese. He was going to end the Vietnam War before the election. We know this. He says, I'm reading their hand, Everett. This is treason. And Everett Dirksen says, yes, it is. And he says, you got to tell them, and then LBJ goes on to say, we can't let the American people know about this, Everett. It'll destroy their confidence in America. Back to you, sir.
Well, what it does is it destroys the confidence in the Republican and Democratic Party.
Yes.
That's what they're most fearful about. And we know that Richard Nixon cut the deal with the Vietnamese. We know that the Reagan-Bush administration in 1980 cut the deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. We know who was in the meeting. We know the meetings were in Paris. We know the meetings were in Madrid. We know all about that. And when, in fact, anybody tried to raise that in any of the major news media, et cetera, for example, the New York Times, it's not news that is fit to print. It is not fit to print. And so they will not reveal that because there is a clique, a kind of a governing elite in the United States. I know because I got the biggest scholarship ever awarded to an American to go to Harvard College. And I came out of a blue collar setting. My father was the first Sheehan man in our family ever to graduate from high school. And so I ended up getting to go to Harvard and go to Harvard Law School, where I was there with all these people from all of the major private schools and the private academies that came in there. I see how they train an entire class of people to govern in this country. That's why you see so often the people that are presidents and senators and others, they're from Harvard and Yale and from the other Ivy League schools. They all belong to the same clubs. They all in fact, marry each other's daughters and sons. It's an elite, a kind of a royalist set, and they're very much connected to the major financial houses. You get people like Brown Brothers Harriman, where you have J.P. Morgan as part of that. The Rockefellers are all part of that. The major financial barons are all part of that. And the chairman, of the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman was George Herbert Walker.
And before that, Prescott Bush.
That's right. He was
who was dealing with the Nazis.
Prescott Bush, in fact, married the daughter of George Herbert Walker, and that's how he got to be the chairman of the board of Brown Brothers Harriman. When George Herbert Walker went and set up a bank, the Union Bank of New York, that helped set up a branch in the Netherlands that helped fund Hitler to rise to power as the bulwark against communism in Europe. Now, these are historical facts that those of us who work in this area, this special area, have come to know very well. What we've been trying to do is, when we had some access to the judicial branch, we could get to the judicial branch and place this type of information before a jury and ask a jury to decide what they think about something like this. The problem is now that with such a huge majority of the federal judges all appointed by Ronald Reagan, George Bush, or left over from Richard Nixon and Ford, you know, the problem is that they don't care about the Constitution. They basically think that the Constitution is a ship that sits in the harbor in Boston, that this is a political war that they view themselves as being involved in. And what we have to try to decide is whether or not we as American citizens are going to join together to rise up to do something about this. This is what we talk about in the book. That's what the People's Advocate is all about. That when I represent individuals, that it's not representing just the individual, it's representing our entire American people, attempting to stand up and take power back away from this ruling elite and take it back into the hands of the people. That's what the book is all about. That's why people should read the book, and then they should really figure out what to do in the present situation. For example, with the National Defense Authorization Act that was signed into law at 11:55 p.m. on New Year's Eve of 2011 by Obama, which authorizes the arrest of us and put in front of military tribunals. We need to move and organize ourselves to establish constitutional protection zones. We need to go to the city councils in our city. We need to go to our county boards of supervisors and have them declare that they will instruct our law enforcement officers to not allow any federal officials to come into their jurisdiction and attempt to enforce that unconstitutional statute, just like we did when we established the nuclear-free zones, to stop the American federal government from transporting the the nuclear waste from the 103 nuclear facilities in the country. After we won the Karen Silkwood case in the 3 Mile Island litigation, I was chief counsel in both of those cases. And what we did is we enforced that opinion from the court. We enforced it by getting city councils and county boards of supervisors to declare their jurisdictions to be nuclear-free zones so that the government could not transport those waste materials from those 103 facilities and put them under Yucca Mountain in Nevada, which is what they were trying to do, which we later discovered was over the largest aquifer in the entire Southwest. The American people, we need to understand that we cannot rely upon this class of people, this elite class of people, to rule in our favor, because they won't. They will rule in favor of the bankers. They will rule in favor of the major corporations. They will rule in favor of the other people in their elite clan that they've got. That we need to rise up and to assert ourselves and to go into our local city councils, our local boards of supervisors, and declare that they will instruct their law enforcement officials to defy any federal official that tries to come into their jurisdiction to enforce that statute, which is clearly and plainly not only unconstitutional, but in absolute defiance of the most fundamental principles of our Constitution, depriving us of free speech, freedom of association, the right to counsel, the right to habeas corpus. The most fundamental pillars of our entire constitutional system have been set aside by that particular statute, all in the name of alleged anti-terrorism. After the Bush administration, George Bush Sr., sent 250,000 United States military forces into the heartland of the oil fields of the Middle East to attempt to establish full spectrum dominance over the natural resources of the planet as soon as the Soviet Union voluntarily dissolved. That's what we're faced at the present time with, and the American people need to wake up and mobilize. That's what lawyers are for, and that's why the People's Advocate is advocating these type of things for all of the people, one by one, and all collectively. That's what I do as a profession.
In the minute and a half or 2 minutes that we have left, I'm curious your thoughts on the generational dimension of this. You talk about this at some length in the introduction to your book.
Oh yeah. Well, what it is there's a book that was written by William Strauss and Neil Howe. It's called Generations: The History of America's Future. And what it points out is that in every 100-year period, there are 4 generations that are born from approximately 21 to 25 years each. And what the 1960s, the period that's referred to as the 60s, really represented a fundamental confrontation between our generation, the idealist generation of the 21st century, 82 million people strong, in rising up to attempt to get the World War II generation to come to grips with the fundamental flaws that we had discovered in the system. And now those flaws are coming to full fruition with the massive global climate change that we're confronted with, the grossly unstable economy that we have now. These are crises that are going to fall upon the new generation, the civic generation of the millennials, the second largest and the second best educated generation in the history of the world, 72 million strong. We need to form a coalition to organize ourselves to remedy these fundamental problems, because the idealists are aware of what the fundamental ideals of our country are. In the civic generation, the millennialists are the ones who are going to have to confront and resolve these fundamental crises of the 21st century. That's what William Strauss and Neil Hall talk about in their book called Generations, A History of America's Future, and this is what I discuss at some length in the book, to explain why it is that our generation got into such a major confrontation with the World War II generation of George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan and the others. And that is what we need to train our people, the next generation, the millennial generation, to partner with us to address these fundamental crises. That's what the book is all about. I think that's what the People's Advocate is about.
And I think you've absolutely nailed it. In fact, it's astounding to me when I travel around the country speaking on these issues, the audiences are made up of people in their 20s and people in their 50s and 60s and 70s. Right. Daniel Sheehan, you've written a brilliant book. You've lived an extraordinary life, and you continue to do extraordinary work. The People's Advocate, the life and legal history of America's most fearless public interest lawyer. It's been an honor to have you on the program tonight. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. To see this and other Conversations with Great Minds, go to our website at conversationswithgreatminds.com.